Hello, my name is Casey Wayland, and I'm going to be going through a whole bunch of tutorials about how to set up Pro Tools and how to go through all the little intricacies that Pro Tools tends to throw at you. One of the things I've run into a lot because I do teach Pro Tools to a lot of different students and editors, there's a lot of little things that if you don't get right from the get-go, they can be problematic later. And I think also it's one of the things that when people approach Pro Tools, it makes it a little intimidating for them. So I just want to start from the very start of opening up Pro Tools for the first time and kind of go through all the little things that you want to do to set up everything first. And so let's dive in. Once you first open up Pro Tools, you'll notice that you get this little dashboard thing. Most of these little getting started tutorials are, helpful, especially if you're doing some templates and whatnot you want to have loaded. But honestly, I kind of like starting from scratch. So let's just go up to new. And we're going to go ahead and create a new session here. I always put it on local storage. One of the things that Pro Tools does offer is you can have an online account so that you can use this for, editing online and have your sessions saved there. For me, I use Pro Tools a lot for post-production, so local storage is always the better way to go. I also don't create from a template because you got to learn how to kind of make from scratch, really. Jumping down here, we'll set the file type. WAV is the standard. Sample rate is 48. This can go higher. You can go up much higher. 48 kilohertz is kind of a digital video standard. Honestly, it's probably all you're going to need for most of your stuff. 96 is pretty high, but 48 is pretty standard. 16-bit or 24, if you're doing like Atmos, 24-bit is kind of standard, but realistically, 16-bit 48 is a pretty good standard measurement. If you're doing any sort of podcasts or digital video publishing, these two settings are almost pretty much standard across the board. I always put on interleaved. What interleaved means is that when you bring in a stereo file, it keeps the files as a stereo file in your audio bin rather than splitting them up into left and right channels. Just something you do want to select when you're first creating a session. And then we'll go ahead and put a name in here. I'm just going to let the location go on my documents for now. This literally is just going to be for an initial setup, this session. I'm not even going to bring in any audio just yet. This is only just to cover all the bases for when you first open a session. So we're going to call this First Open and go ahead and click on Create. So the first thing I'd like to go over is actually what a Pro Tools session is. So when you first create a Pro Tools session, it will make a folder with a whole bunch of different stuff inside of it. You have an audio files folder, a bounce files folder, clip groups, your PTX file, and this is essentially your Pro Tools session file backups, and video files, and then waveform cache. The only ones you really need to worry about are going to be audio files. This is where all your audio files should be stored when you bring them in. That's the one that's going to have all the bits and pieces for your session. If you were to give somebody a session, you don't want to just give them this PTX file. They're going to need all the audio files contained within. There's some settings you want to make sure that you set to make sure that all your audio files do go in there. One of the things I will say is whenever you are saving your session, it's going to go into that folder and it'll be inside of here. I'm a big fan of when you create file names and you save something, you can actually see what it is and it's very clear. So say for instance, you're working on a session that other people are going to open. I like to put in what this is. Say this is a rough cut, RC for rough cut, KC, that's me. And then I say version 1. And I can hit save. Typically what I will do is as I'm editing every couple hours or so, I might save a new version. Sometimes I'll also put the date in here as well. That way you can see what the date of the version is. I also recommend, especially to my students who think they have made a final version of their project, never label something final because it's never, I feel like nothing is ever final. Always put a version number in here and just keep on escalating because then you can just keep going forever. Okay, so one of the other things I want to talk about is when you first open up Pro Tools, you want to make sure that your system is set up properly. If you go to Setup and Playback Engine, this essentially is how Pro Tools will be able to play out to your speakers or your headphones or something like that. On a Mac, you have the options. The standard ones are Pro Tools Aggregate I/O. The Aggregate I/O means that you can select that and have it go out the speakers, have it go out your headphone jack. It's something that you can specify and change. There's a lot of little details that are involved with that. Like, for instance, if you go into audio MIDI setup, This essentially controls your aggregate I/O. So you can actually change what devices are actually used. You can, set it to your AirPods, things like that. For the simplicity's sake, I'm just going to leave that alone for now. If you're going to be professionally editing or even consumer editing, eventually getting a ASIO compliant sound card is really important. The system that I have plugged in right now is just a Focusrite. This is a very simple box. They're not very expensive anymore. I mean, they do cost about $100, but it does give you XLRs. It does give you balanced outputs for your monitors or for your headphones if you want to plug in with a 1/4-inch adapter. So it's definitely gives you a lot of options for what you want. In settings here, this is hardware buffer size. Now, one of the things I will say is that if you're setting this, if you are recording something, you want this to be low. If you are playing something back and you have a lot of plugins and things that are processing your audio, you want to set this a little higher. Essentially, what this is almost like a buffer for the computer to process the audio that you're listening to. So if you set it really low here, when you hit play, you're going to instantly hear it back and it's going to be feeding to your headsets instantaneously. That's great for recording because if you're talking into your microphone, you don't want a big delay going to your headsets because then it has this like delay compensation and you feel like you're speaking slower because your voice is coming in like just half a heartbeat later, and it gets really annoying. So recording, you want to set this low, and then for playback, if you have a lot of plugins, you set it higher. You can change it at any time. You can go back and forth between all of these, and it can just very simply change as you go. I'm just going to go ahead and I'll leave it on 128 for now because that doesn't really matter that much. All these little optimizations down here, if you have a slower system, these are really nice ways of making sure your system can compensate for some of the lag that the CPU may be giving you. Really, I only leave these two, the aux IO and the dynamic plug-in processing, enabled. The other ones can be done. You can limit the number of real-time threads if you are running into some buffer issues or if the system isn't able to keep up with what you're doing. And I'll just leave that as normal. So that's the playback engine. That essentially just tells Pro Tools how you're going to play the audio out of the system. Okay, so now that Pro Tools is open, this is sort of the default view you might see. And one of the first things I do like to change whenever I come into here, and this is sometimes it's controversial, not very popular, is I like to change to the classic mode instead of dark mode. So if you go to Pro Tools and settings, this is all the different settings that are underneath the hood of Pro Tools. And right here in the very first page under display is the UI theme dark. I go to classic. And the reason why is because when you're bringing in a waveform and you're trying to see it, I believe that you can see it better in classic mode than dark mode. I'll give you a little example real quickly. Okay, so I very quickly just dragged a clip into my timeline here, and you can see the waveform here. I'm not going to get ahead of you, but you can clearly see, the details of the audio. In dark mode, that is not as clear, in my opinion anyway. When you are going through and say, for instance, you are doing automation and you want to see the volume trim, all of a sudden it's really hard to see the waveform in the background. And so when you're trying to do the compensation and raise and lower and put points in here, it's really hard to see. But in classic mode, it's a lot easier to see against the gray background. I don't know if they're ever going to change that, but there's a lot of quirks in Pro Tools, and this is just one of them. So I just stick to classic mode instead of dark mode. Okay, so the next setting that I recommend for most users to do is to change your autosave settings. So if you go to the Operation tab here and go down here, it says Enable Session File Auto Backup. Always keep that enabled, never turn that off. But the amount of session backups to keep, I always set to 20. And for backup, I always say 3 minutes. And the reason I do that is because it's not saving it so often that it has any sort of lag or anything that happens to it. And 20 most recent session backups, I think, is a good safe bet. That way it gives you roughly an hour of, I need to go back and get something that went wrong. This is really important because, say, for instance, you are working along in a session and you've done something and you have only so many ways to undo it and you have to come back and fix it. This lets you have a backup of everything. What this does is auto backup is it's not actually backing up on top of itself, If I were to go back into my session folder, and this is the session folder again that has all my information, if I open up session file backups, I'll notice that this right here is all my backups. And I'll see that, okay, it's saved about 4 minutes ago. It'll save again. And it'll just keep filling this session file backups folder with, I set it for 20 versions. So it'll save 20 different versions in here as it goes, in case there's anything I need to go back to. And it has happened where, a session file will corrupt and you'll have to go to a session file backup because it happens. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does happen, it's very, very helpful. Or say, for instance, you had somebody recently open the session, do something, and then save it again, and then they did something wrong. You can go back through the attic, essentially, get your session file backup, and then you've got everything restored. Okay, the next up is metering. So one of the things that I've noticed in here is metering. These meters are all, they tend to change. I don't know why, if it's a default or whatnot, but I always make sure that these are set for digital VU. The track meters, digital VU, the master meters, digital VU, the advanced meter, all of these I set for digital VU, and I just leave them all defaults from here. It's just a really good way of making sure that when you look at your meters on the left side, they're all the same. And digital VU, I think, is one of the better ones because you kind of shoot for a certain color as it peaks in that meter. So yeah, so set those to digital VU. Again, these settings are things that I think work best. There are going to be some people who disagree with me, but that's what it is. The most important setting I think that you can set in any of these preferences is right here. Automatically copy files on import. What this means is that when I drag a file into my session or bring something in, it's automatically going to copy to my audio files folder. That's really important because, say, for instance, you're working on a different workstation, you're working on a laptop, you're moving your session from one place to another, you're backing up something. You want to make sure that all your files for your audio are consolidated in one location and you're not having to find them places. This is really important, I think, especially for my students who are downloading a sound effect. The sound effect goes in the downloads bin inside their computer. They drag it into their session. They save their session. They open it up on another computer, and all of a sudden the file's offline because it's on that other system in the downloads folder still. If this is not selected, you're going to have a lot of files offline later. It's just so much easier to turn this on. Why it's off by default? I guess for network preferences, I guess. But honestly, this is one of the things that you want to turn on and make sure it just stays on from then on. If you go to another station, the preferences sometimes are different from station to station. So if you're going from a computer to computer, you might want to check these again. But typically, if you're opening up a session again, they should stay within the session. Okay, and that's pretty much it for this section here. I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. That covers most everything in the preferences area. The other thing that I'm going to say is this metering section here. In options, there is an option for pre-fader metering. Now, what this means is that the meter that's over here is going to be reading whatever your pre-fader is. So, say, for instance, you are recording something and you have your input levels changed or something like that. You want to make sure that pre-fader metering is on. This allows you to see the meter of what's coming into the system. Now, once you're editing, you can go ahead and turn that off, and it's going to make sure that the meter that you're seeing here is read off of your timeline. It's a small little thing to switch when you are going from recording to editing. If you're only going to be editing on your system, you can just go ahead and turn that off, and you shouldn't have to worry about it. But if you're recording, it is good to have that on. Okay, moving up here to the top section, there are a couple little settings in here that I think are really important that I would have on by default. So these two options up here, this is for linking timeline and edit selection and linking track and edit selection. I have both of these on by default because typically when I'm doing something inside of a track, I have the track selected over here on the left. It's just something that I do by default, and it kind of clears up a little bit of a headache later on for the most part. They're a little bit not super necessary, but I just have them on by default. The other one is really important in my opinion, unless there's a couple instances that it's not really as necessary, but this is timeline insertion follows playback. What this means is if you were to play the timeline and you hit spacebar again, it stops right where you hit spacebar. So if you're doing any editing for like post production, like I do, and you hear something, you're like, oh, I need to fix that, and you hit spacebar to stop it, then you can go right back to where that spot was. If this is off, it goes right back to where you initially started. Now, that can be a really good technique to use. Say, for instance, if you're doing music and you're trying to listen to something over and over and over again, that's fine. I have this on by default because it's so much easier. It's basically how most nonlinear editors work, and it's off by default. So turning that on is really good. This one is really important. If it's off, it turns orange because it's a warning sign. What this means is automation follows the edit. So say, for instance, down here, you're going through and doing some editing and you have automation on your timeline. Automation, if you're not aware, and I'll cover this a little bit later, is basically like the points that are on your timeline. So if there's a couple points in here and you have to move this somewhere else, the edit points you want to go with your clip. So say, for instance, you move this down, the automation that I have with the clip goes with it, which is exactly what you want. I would never turn this off. You want to have your levels follow what it is that you're exactly doing inside your timeline. So that's really important. The only time I ever turn it off, I want to keep the automation, but I'm replacing the clip underneath. Like say, for instance, I've already done the levels of automation for like a background sound effect, and I have it already there, and I just want to swap it out, like swap the sound effect out, but keep the automation, then I'll turn that off and then move it on. The next one after this is markers move with clips. The more you use clips and markers, if you add a marker that goes along with the clip, like say, for instance, you want to add a marker here and say, okay, there's a mistake on this sound effect. And then you mark it like right there so to be fixed later. With that enabled, when you move your clip, the marker goes with it. Great. Awesome. A really handy tool to use. But if you turn that off and you move it, the marker doesn't go with it. After that, there's not a huge amount of settings up here that are really that important. One of the ones I do like to turn off, you may like it, you may not, is grid. The grid, if you turn off and on, you'll notice there's all these little lines here. And you can change the grid amount too. You can change the intervals of how many of those little tick marks are inside there. I'm not doing music for the most part, so the grid doesn't really help me that much. It can help maybe some people move things because you can snap to grid and things like that. But for the most part, I find it unnecessary to have all those little lines in there, and I find it cleaner and easier on the eye to see it this way. The other things I would turn off over here are this little metronome and then this little conductor guy. I'm not doing music. If I was, those might be important in some capacity, but really it's not something that I really need to worry about for now. Okay, so now let's get into your timeline view here. The first thing to do is actually up here at the top. This sets the scale of time for your entire timeline. You don't really change this very often. If you're working with songs and music, bars and beats may be your way to go. If you're doing anything in post-production, you're going to want to go to timecode. Now, there are two types of timecode in here in a way. There's minutes and seconds and timecode. And for the most part, they are the same, but not really. So timecode is pretty absolute with how it works here. Usually it is adjusted to the frame rate. Minutes and seconds has minutes and seconds. Not something you really need to worry about, but I always recommend just moving it into timecode if you're doing anything in production. It's just easier to deal with in the long run in terms of knowing and understanding exactly where everything is. I work with a music composer all the time, and because we want to make sure that we're as accurate as possible, timecode is always better than dealing with minutes and seconds, because sometimes then you're dealing with sub-seconds and things like that, and not something that I really want to deal with. Coming down here, I'm working on a laptop screen right now just to kind of show you how condensed this all can end up being. And there's a lot of extra information that you don't necessarily need when dealing with your timeline here that you can get rid of and give you a lot more real estate. First one being, you can take out bars and beats, you can take out minutes and seconds, and you can take out samples. Then you can take out tempo and meter. Unless you're doing a lot of musical stuff, obviously if you want to have your tempo and meter in there, if you're doing music, great, by all means. But look how much space it gives us now. This is so much more streamlined, and we only have one scale here to deal with rather than multiple. You can always turn them back on and turn them off. Not a huge thing. One thing I will say is that there are multiple marker tracks now, and I am a huge fan of this. If you only need one marker track, great. leave it on one. But say, for instance, in the ways that I use it, I'm just going to give two for instances. So one of them, let's say, is I have audio cues, audio cue, and the other one is for ADR marker. So say, for instance, I have a line that I want to have replaced later on. I might add a marker in here to say, okay, replace Nick's line, and then more energy. And so it's on that line. And then maybe I have, this is where scene 101 starts. So I might say 101, maybe scene 101. And so that way I have different tracks for different markers. One of the ones I like to do is fix this. Maybe there's an error on the timeline. I'll be like, okay, remove pop. And maybe you don't want to do it all right now. Maybe you want to do it later. But if you just put a marker there for now, you can come back to it. And then when you've fixed that pop, you can then just get rid of the marker. It's really good also, like I do this for Foley as well. Like, oh, hey, come back here, do Foley for these footsteps. And then as I'm doing Foley, I just remove the markers. And so when it's all done, I have a clean track. And it's easier to manage that way. The other thing that you want to make sure that you do, and I did this earlier just by default, when you open up Pro Tools, no keyboard shortcuts actually work at first. It's weird, but right here is the reason why. It is this keyboard focus button. By default, it's over here in your clips bin. The clips bin is where all the information for the clips being anything you brought into your timeline, will end up over here in your clips bin. And the reason why it's over here is because if you were to type in a letter, it goes to that letter here. So I hit Z and it went to zoom. I don't think that's really helpful at all. Really, the keyboard focus needs to be inside your timeline view. Speaking of the clips and tracks over here on the left and right, this clips bin I find is pretty useless for the most part, especially starting out. You can collapse it down here by hitting this little arrow, and that'll collapse it completely. Or you can bring it back with just expanding that arrow. I find that especially early on when you are editing, the clips bin and the tracks and groups section over here on the left and right, they take up a lot of space and it's not super necessary right away. And so I tend to collapse them, especially it gives you a lot more real estate inside of your edit window here to be able to do whatever you need to do. Okay, now that all of your settings are all set, let's go ahead and just create some tracks. Now, I have this track here already in place because I drug a clip onto it. I'm just going to go ahead and hide that track for now. We'll pretend it doesn't exist, and I'll get rid of my markers because they're not totally necessary. I'm just going to go up here to go to track and click on new. Now, there are a lot of options in here. These are not too difficult to understand. I'll just go through one at a time here. This is how many tracks you're going to create. Create one mono audio track in samples, and it's called audio. You hit create, and that just gives you one track in mono meaning one channel. That doesn't mean you're only going to hear one channel left or one channel right, because it's going to output 1 and 2, which is the output of the system. You're getting one channel that'll go into 2. So if I put my vocal recording from a single mic in here, it'll go out to both speakers. That's creating just a simple audio track. An audio track can contain clips. This is where you're going to do a lot of your editing. By default, Pro Tools hides some of your track features inside of here. If you click into this track view here, you're going to see comments, you're going to see instrument, inserts, I/O, and there's object, real-time properties, track color, and marker colors. I enable comments, inserts, and I/O. The other ones are very helpful. The sends are important, and the I/O is important. Object only applies for Atmos stuff, so you can just leave that off for now. But having those available and selected give you this view here, which is very, very important. One of the things that I run into all the time, especially with anybody who's doing any recording, is that if I/O is hidden, they can't set their input properly for their recording. They're trying to, do an input here, and they can't set it because by default it's hidden. So it's like, how do I record? And by not having this view available, you don't know where your in is or your out is, which is very, very important. So that's just what a standard track is. Now, if I were to create a stereo track and just hit create, I've created a stereo track on my timeline. And you notice over here it has 2 channels rather than the one on the audio 1 track. That means that I can bring in a stereo file that I'll have left and right, and it'll treat it as one clip together. That's important because, say, for instance, you're dealing with something that like is a atmosphere file or a sound effect that already has a left and a right channel in it. It preserves that and treats it just as one. That way it doesn't separate the two. Going into other tracks here that are very important. Over here, we have a routing folder, basic folder, all these other things. Let's talk about master faders first. I'm going to create one stereo master fader in samples, and we'll call it master and click create. This is one of those instances where you may not actually rename the track because the track is exactly what you want it to be. What this means is the master track is every single track that's in your session will come out to this point. It right now is set up for the I/O for output 1 and 2, meaning that anything that's going out of our system is going to go through this track here. It's like a summation point for you to be able to monitor your levels going out. So say, for instance, you are creating a session and you're exporting and you want to make sure that nothing is going too loud. You can watch your master meter here, and it basically monitors everything from your tracks below, which would be very, very important for us to put a loudness meter on that. Actually, I'm going to do that now. So one of the reasons why I put a loudness meter on my master track first is because whatever I'm doing, I want to be able to know exactly what the levels are going out. The meters that Pro Tools has on the sides here, they're very helpful, but they also don't really have any number scale. You don't know what the levels are that are going out. So if you're adjusting your monitor level, say you have a volume knob on your device, or you have a headphone that has a volume knob on it, you don't really know what the output level will be. So you want to make sure that it's standard and it's going to go out the right amount. That's how all audio is done. It's set to sort of a loudness standard. So right here in inserts, I'm going to go ahead and click on inserts, multi-channel plugin. I'll go to sound field and I'll go to Ulean loudness meter 2. Now you won't have this by default. Anything that's inside these inserts is considered what is called a plugin. A plugin, some of them are native to Pro Tools. So say, for instance, you go up to EQ, you'll have this EQ 7 band. Those are all ones that are built into Pro Tools. But this one here is not. This is actually a plugin that you can download. They have a free version on their website that allows you to monitor your levels going out. So anything that is on your timeline, this is how you can monitor it. And they have all these presets in here to be able to know exactly what levels you are trying to monitor. You'll notice sometimes the scale will change at -24 for that one. Everything down here is part of the Pro version, which means you have to pay for the program to get access to these, which changes the loudness meters to some of these standards. But really, the free version, if you go to ASWG R001 portable, that sets it for -18, and -18 is a pretty good meter to go off of. -18 and -16, I think, is probably the good range to go for most online content or anything that needs to be monitored. If it goes to -24 or lower, sometimes you have to really crank up the gains of wherever you're playing it to be able to hear it. So -18, -16 is really a better scale to go with. I'll come back to this later, but what this will do is when I click on it, I can monitor the levels going out, which is very important, especially being able to get that standard. Because if you see, now we have a scale, we can tell when it's going too loud. And actually, because this loudness meter is here, we'll see in a graph, when it goes too loud, it'll turn red. So we know when something is peaking, meaning that it goes too loud. But for now, I'll go ahead and close that down. So that's a master fader with the insert for your metering. Okay, looking over here at tracks again, there are other tracks that are inside here. We have mono and stereo. We have a whole bunch of other ones too that go into like surround sound settings. I'm going to leave those alone for now because mono and stereo are really the only two that you're probably going to deal with for the most part, especially just starting out. After that, there are other ones that are actually very helpful. We have auxiliary inputs, VCA masters, and instruments or MIDI tracks here. All of these are very, very helpful. And then we also have routing folders and basic folders. These allow you to group tracks that can be, put into groups together. Let's go ahead and we'll cover each one at a time. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to make one of each right now. And if you want to create multiple tracks at the same time, you can just click this little plus and you can add in a whole bunch more at the same time. I'm actually going to create a auxiliary input stereo. And then down here, I'm going to go ahead and make this a basic folder. And you'll notice that it actually does not have a mono or stereo setting anymore, and it's not in samples because it's just a folder. It only is a folder, and it can contain tracks inside that folder, so you can group things together. And then down here, I'm going to go ahead and make a VCA master. And you'll notice that it also goes away with stereo and mono, and I'll get to that in a second. And the last one here, I'm going to go ahead and make a instrument track, and I'll make that stereo. Now, this is just for demonstration purposes. You don't need to make any of these yourself. I just want to show you what they are so that you have an understanding of what they do. Okay, so the very first thing is a folder. Now, a folder is great because if I drag the folder down, and you can move folders and tracks by selecting their titles of the tracks and just dragging them down and dropping them. So say, for instance, audio 1 and audio 2 here, I want to group into that folder. So if I hold the shift key and grab both of them and drag them in that folder, now they're inside that folder. And I can collapse it by clicking that button there, so that I can collapse and expand it. As you get more and more tracks, this is actually very helpful because you're like, okay, my vocals are all in one folder, so let me expand my vocals folder so I can see all the vocals in there, and then maybe when I'm just doing sound effects editing, I can just expand just the sound effects. And it's a good way to logically organize everything that you have inside your session. If you ever get lost and you're like, okay, where is anything? You can bring back your track view over here on the left, and you can see everything in the list. It also allows you to see things that are hidden. Hidden tracks have this little grayed out icon that you can bring back or hide. It doesn't mean that when you play back, you'll actually still hear them. It just means that they're not visible. If you ever want to disable a track and not have it be active, meaning that you can't hear it, you right-click on it, you can say make inactive, and the track goes gray. That allows this track to still exist, but then be inactive. This is helpful because, say, for instance, you're doing a lot of editing and you make a duplicate track of something, and you're like, I'm just duplicating this just, so I have a backup inside my session, and then make it inactive. Great. Sometimes also you may want to have this inactive because you have some plugins on here that take a lot of computer power, and you don't want to have them active. You can make them inactive. So that's what a folder does. Okay, next up is an auxiliary channel. An auxiliary channel is very helpful because it's another way of sort of grouping a signal together like a master, but it's almost like a submaster, if that makes sense. Where, say, for instance, I have an auxiliary here, and I have a whole bunch of vocals, like I have, 5 different vocal tracks, and then I can have them all go into my auxiliary. Where that's helpful is it basically lets you route a signal from, say, 5 different tracks into one to then maybe get a special effect put onto it. I'm going to cover what those are later on, but it's very helpful to be able to keep things kind of streamlined, especially when you're trying to do something like, say, reverb. If I have 5 characters and 5 tracks for 5 characters, and I want to apply a reverb to all of them, I'll have them go to the auxiliary and then to the output, and then apply the reverb on just that auxiliary. That way it's only one reverb being applied, but it's applying it to 5 different characters. And it saves the computer a lot of processing power. Also, if you want to make changes, it's easier to do it in one point instead of 5 different subtracks. I will go into all the details of that later on, but that just wanted to show what an auxiliary track is. This also is a track that you can't drag any clips in. You can have no clips on this track, same as the master. These are only for signal routing. The last one here, before I get to instruments, is the VCA. A VCA is essentially a way to control automation of multiple tracks at the same time through grouping them. This is probably one of the more complicated tracks to talk about. I'm not going to talk about it just yet because it's a fairly high advanced feature, but it's really helpful to be able to do mixing with because it will control multiple tracks beneath it at the same time. And the last one is instrument track. This is if you want to do any MIDI recording. If you have a MIDI keyboard or something like that, if you don't know what MIDI is, essentially means that there's like notes on a keyboard that will be recorded in here that will allow you to like record a piano or anything that you can adjust the notes later on. And it's sort of like data bits of information that correspond to an instrument. If you're a musician, you're like, yeah, I kind of know what MIDI is. MIDI is essentially if you push a keyboard note, like an A note or something like that, it'll record an A note on the computer. And then so that way you can reproduce it here for various different instruments. And you can change the note if you want to later. It's sort of like all the keys that you push and how hard you push them can get saved into this track here. That's what a MIDI track essentially does. For now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get rid of these tracks here. I just wanted to show you what they were. I will keep the folder for now, just because it's a good demo to have. Folders, I feel, are the most advantageous of the entire group. Okay, let's look into what these tracks have over here on the left. So we have a track title name, and then below that we have the record button, the input monitoring button, the solo button, and the mute button. These are all ways of toggling your track. Like say, for instance, you want to record on track 1. Well, you're going to want to hit the record button here and it'll blink and it's armed. Essentially, when you start to record, then it'll lay down track there. But this is important because if you're recording directly into Pro Tools, you want to make sure that, your input is going onto your track. And in your I/O panel, you can say input 1. Essentially, input 1 corresponds with my Focusrite box right now. Input 1 being my XLR connection here. Input 2 is the instrument 1 that's right next to it. The audio interfaces that you have various inputs and outputs. This one only has 2 inputs, and it has, I think, 2 outputs, so it's real simple. And then that's how you can set it here. Say, for instance, you had 2 microphones plugged in, and you have this track for input 1, and then maybe another mono track is input 2. You can record that, and that way you have 2 tracks recording into the system at the exact same time. But if you don't arm the system, it won't know that you want to record onto it. This is sort of like tells the system, hey, start recording out of this track. If I were to arm the master record up here and hit play, you'll see what that's like. You'll see that now it's laying down track. I have no input going into the system right now, so that's why you see this being a completely flat bar. I'll go ahead and hit stop, and that makes what's called a clip on your timeline. Sound effects and everything else end up on your timeline as clips. The other thing I want to talk about is this is the input monitoring button. Say, for instance, you wanted to monitor your input but not actually record it. This is kind of handy. Like, say, for instance, you're in a recording studio and you have a microphone for the control booth is going into the system through one of these inputs, and you don't want to record it, but you just want to have it go through Pro Tools. That's what that little I button does. Doesn't record it, but lets the input of the system become essentially hot. After that, you have solo and then mute. Solo functions really easy. If you have one bit of information, this track here, if you solo it and played it, means it's only going to hear that track. And mute is the exact opposite. It will mute this track so that all the others are able to be heard. After that, we have waveform. This is how you can view a track. So say, for instance, I'm going to bring this track back up here. I'll make it active again. Right now, it's on waveform. If I go ahead and click on blocks, the audio's there, but you can't see the waveform because it's a big block. I don't know why anybody would want that, but it's there. Playlists, I will talk about for a more advanced section, but that's one option. Basically, you have a track and then you have alternates of that track. Markers, this is if you just want the markers just on your track alone by itself. I don't know why you'd want that, but it's there. Waveform, this is the default that you'll see. It allows you to see the waveform of your timeline and the clips so you can see everything as they are. And then you have volume. This displays what's called volume automation. Automation being something that you can change over time. It's automated, meaning it can go up and down. And there's a lot of things that can be automated inside of Pro Tools. One of the reasons why it's such a successful program. But for most of us, we will use it at first just for volume. And then we have volume trim. Not going to talk about that one because it's practically the same thing, but not. Mute and pan. Mute is basically turning your track on and off. I don't like messing with it because, if you want to mute your track for a certain point of time, great. I don't like doing it with automation. Pan is the only one that might be slightly important if you want to start doing some stereophonic effects and things like that. If you look up here, now it turned into a left and a right. If I want this mono track to only go through the left speaker, I could just kind of pull it up to the top there. If I want to go only to the right, I can pull it down there. I'm going to go into adjusting things in here in just a second, but that's essentially what you would do for if you want to change your left and rights. But mostly waveform and volume are the only ones you're really going to work with for the most part. Down here, there is some other options. We're going to skip them for now. The only one right here that's important is a read or latch. Just leave it on read. That's the default, because what that means is it reads the automation here on your timeline. You don't want to have that anything else, especially just starting out. Moving across, we have comments. I find the comment section very helpful when working with many editors. I might put a character name over here, like this is Alex's primary mic. If we have two different mics for the same person, we might put details in there. Or custom EQ applied. Stuff like that, that might be pertinent for another editor to know, like, oh, the insert in here for EQ, everyone's got an EQ, but this one has a special one or something like that. Sometimes I'll also put, like, if there's a reverb channel here, I'll actually even put, like, insert A here. The reverb track is for this room atmosphere. It's the interior hallway. And the second one, B, is for the outside shed. Things like that, just to put them in the comments so it's easy to know what is what. Last but not least, this panel here, this is the I/O panel, meaning I input, O output. For input 1, input 2, that means the input coming into the system. The second one being output. Now, the output right now is set for the default output 1 and 2. That means left channel, right channel, 1, 2. If you have, like this Focusrite box has a left and a right out, that will give us a left and a right out. Essentially, that means that this track is going out to that. Would you ever change this? You can. In one of the more advanced sections I'll talk about, you can use something like a bus. A bus is a virtual output. So if you think about it, you have a track. And instead of just going directly to the output, you can have it go to a bus, and the bus can go to another track, have some processing applied, and then go to the output. It's basically a signal flow. The signal goes out of the track into another, and then back out. The way that can be helpful is because, like I said before, if you have like 5 characters and you want to apply an effect to all 5 of them, you can do it through like an auxiliary channel track. And that way you don't have to apply the track processing to every track individually. It will make a lot of sense once I get to that point. But for now, we're just going to leave it as is. Other things that are really important in these tracks, the biggest thing is renaming your tracks, because Audio 1 tells you nothing. So if I have this as Vox 1, Vox or Vocal Track 1, and go ahead and click on OK, it changed the name of the track. Very, very, very important. One of my pet peeves is not seeing labeled tracks. I mean, if you have a lot of tracks and you don't label them, you're going to have no idea what goes where. And then all of a sudden your timeline just becomes a mess. And it will impede how fast you're going to be able to edit things later on. So I have that as Vox, and we'll call this Sound Effects 1. Sometimes I'll even, because this is a stereo track, I might even say Stereo Sound Effects 1 or SFX Stereo 1. You can name them whatever you want, as long as it makes sense to you and makes sense to your other editors. The big thing that's important is when you're passing something from one editor to another, you want to make sure that there's consistency across the board to be able to know where everything is going. The big thing also is for track organization is to be able to apply colors to your tracks, because by default they also end up this blue color, which I like to organize things a little bit more aesthetically. If I see a Vox track, a vocal track, I always change it to orange. That's my organization. I've done it that way for 10 years plus, and it really is helpful to be able to know, okay, is it an orange track? It's a vocal track. For sound effects, my sound effects tracks usually are green. I will go different shades of green. Sometimes mono sound effects will be a brighter green, stereo sound effects a little bit of a darker green. And then green basically is any sort of sound effects track that way. That's just my mental organization for it. But one of the things I will say was when you change the colors, it changes this little bar over here. That's kind of nice. But there are more ways to bring in colorization to your tracks that helps a lot as well. So if we go back into our Pro Tools session and we go into settings here and we go into display, there is a default clip coloring. We're going to go ahead and set this to track color. And the reason why we do that is so whenever you're bringing in a clip, anything on that track will end up being that clip color. So for orange, if you bring in a clip, it'll make that clip orange. So now that I've dragged a clip into this track, I can go ahead and see that the clip itself is orange. A clip is a section of time on your timeline that is a container for audio, essentially. I'm going to get into that in more detail in just a second here. So one of the other things that you can do to add more color to your tracks is if you double click the color palette over here, it'll open up and let you change the colors. But if you open up down here into the UI customization and you go ahead and click on track header saturation and pull that up, all of a sudden it makes your entire track become that color, which is so helpful to be able to see everything. So if I turn this down, you can see it goes back to gray. Not helpful at all. Turn it back up to 100, and whoa, now all of this actually corresponds with the track. So much easier to see visually, what tracks are what types based on that. So I have this on by default for all my sessions, so I can very easily see, okay, there's my master track, and so on and so forth, whatever the sub tracks are from there. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about over here inside of our timeline. Over here in the tools panel, we have several different tools. We have the zoom tool. Zoom tool is pretty easy because, you click on it, it becomes a zoom tool. It zooms in. Yay, you've worked with these before. But how do you zoom out? Well, they don't tell you this really easily, but if you hold the Option or Alt key and click it, then it'll zoom out. But I will say, though, that as you go along, there are so many better ways of doing. There's a lot of ways of doing one thing inside of Pro Tools. A better way to zoom in and out, T and R, the shortcut keys, T and R. T zooms in, R zooms out. I like to think of this the way that I remember it is towards and reverse. T for towards, R for reverse. Just how my brain works. Moving along, next to it, you have this trim tool. If you're familiar with the trim tool in any sort of editing post program, it essentially lets you take the end of a clip and trim off whatever you want. Now, interesting thing enough about this, people think that, okay, when you're trimming a clip, that you get rid of whatever's there. That's not true. So it's non-destructive, meaning that if you trim something off a clip, it's still there. You can still drag it back out. And as long as it's part of the file, it's still going to be there. There are destructive ways of doing this, meaning that you can trim and then it removes what's there, but we're not going to get into those modes. This essentially is a good way of removing and taking off the front end or the back end of a clip. If I go over here and go ahead and drag in, I've trimmed off the back. The trim tool becomes active when you come right to the end of the clip, you see it kind of turns on. You can also just click in your timeline somewhere, and as long as you're past the halfway point of a clip, it'll know which direction you're trying to do. So you see there's the halfway point. If I click that, it'll trim that way. If I go over here, past the halfway point, click that, it'll trim that way. Very easy tool to use for trimming your clips. The next one is the selector tool. This allows you to select different portions of your clip. Say, for instance, you want to select this section here and hit delete. You can cut out the middle of it. Really great tool. Select that portion, hit delete. If you had multiple tracks and multiple things on tracks and you want to delete them all, you could do that as well. Very helpful tool to be able to select the portions of your clip. The last one here is the grabber tool. This allows you to take a clip and move it. Move it left, move it right, move it up, move it down. So if I had multiple tracks, we'll go ahead, drag that down, bam. It allows me to drag into multiple tracks and wherever I want to go. Very, very helpful for moving things around. The last one is the scrubbing tool here. This allows you can't hear it right now, but it lets you like, so it can scrub through a point. Not super helpful, just one of those things. And the last tool at the very end is this pencil tool. If you are in volume mode, there's where you're going to be able to add your points for automation to go up and down and things like that. If you actually click and hold, you can do a lot of points, but then you have so many points in there, it's a little harder to edit. Hit Command Z to undo. Just like in everything else, you can undo and redo things. But I will say one thing that gets really kind of annoying sometimes is that you don't actually have to do Control or Command Z. You can actually just hit Z and it does it. Sometimes that's nice because, oh yeah, I can just hit Z and it undoes it. But sometimes if you slip a finger and hit Z on accident, then you don't want that. The best thing about all these tools up here is the Smart tool. What the Smart tool is when you have this selected, it gives you the trim, the selector, and the grabber tool all at the same time, meaning that if you are in your waveform mode and you go to the very end of the clip in the middle, it turns into that little Cookie Monster cutout, which you can trim the front or the back end. If you go to the top half of a clip, it turns into your selector. If you go to the bottom half of the clip, it turns into the hand, so you can move it around. It's really nice that you don't have to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You can just have all your tools at an instant. So if you're doing a lot of editing, trimming, moving around, there's even more tools inside of here that you can go to the top right corner and it turns into this fade tool. Click and hold that and it turns into an auto fade. Over here, same thing. So now that the sound will fade in and the sound will fade out for that amount. And the fades themselves act sort of like little clips where you can trim them too and have them move back. You can select the fade and delete it if you want to. Very, very helpful tool for all these things and having them all selected at the same time. I never turn this off. It's always on by default. I rarely use the scrubber and I rarely use the pencil as well. Okay, so now that we have all of that set, one of the things I do want to talk about a little bit is this waveform view. So right now, this waveform displays the waveform of the track, meaning that when it's louder, the peaks get higher. When it's smaller, it's not as loud. It's much, much smaller. So you can, if you want to make the waveforms bigger, like say, for instance, you're dealing with a part of the clip. This is actually recorded very loud. But say, for instance, right here in your timeline, say if I zoom in, and I can't see this very well, or say this doesn't have a lot of gain when you first recorded it. Over here on the left, there is this waveform view mode. If you hit up, all of a sudden your waveform gets a lot bigger and you can see the details in there. The problem is that now the scale of everything else is so big that you don't see the waveform anymore. And you can come up here and you can click back down again, but then you can also go in the opposite direction. So now we've made all the waveforms smaller, so we don't really have a good judge of like where this was to begin with. It's not very helpful now, and we want to reset it. So when you've zoomed in a lot or out and you want to reset this back to normal, a very, very helpful keyboard shortcut for this is going to be Command, Option, Control, left bracket. That sets it back to absolute default, so you know exactly where your waveform was at the very beginning, so that way you have a relative scale for knowing how the waveform corresponds with the levels. Because if I was to play this, I can see that, when a waveform gets a certain amount, I can look at the meters and it ends up going a certain amount. One of the things about meters, so when you're looking at your meters over here on the left, a really cool tip that is kind of hidden is if you hold Control, Option, Command, and click on your meters, you can make them double wide. So now you have an even clearer meter to see your volume levels visually over here on the left. I don't know why this isn't on by default, just another one of those things. Okay, a few more very, very, very helpful shortcuts that you'll be using all the time. Say, for instance, in your timeline, you're right here in your clip, and you want to separate it into two different clips that can be edited separately. Go ahead and press the B key, and you will put a break in there. Breaks are nice because, it puts a break in there, and then they can act like two different clips. Very helpful for being able to go through and move things around. Again, if you were to extend this back in, because we haven't moved anything around, the break is no longer there. There's a way to heal it, but for the most part, once you put a break in, you're kind of stuck with it. If you have multiple tracks at the same time, like say, for instance, I had a whole bunch of different tracks down here, and I want to put a break in all of them, I can go ahead and go up here to this little strip of runway here, go ahead and hit the B key, and it'll put a break all the way down the page. So every single track will now have a break at that point. Another thing that's very, very helpful is when you're moving clips around. If, say, for instance, I have this clip over here and I want to move it up and down, you'll notice that it can easily shift out of sync. And say, for instance, especially if I'm dealing with a dialogue track or something that I really don't want to have go out of sync, if I hold the Control key as I go up and down, you'll notice that it locks in place. I can't go left and right, so if I move it up and down, it's not going to go out of sync. Very, very helpful. Now, if I hold the Alt or Option key as I drag something down, I can duplicate it. Alt, if I move into other spaces, is essentially you're copying the clip. If you were to drag a WAV file in multiple times, it actually creates a new one every single time and puts it in your bin. So to keep your bin of files small, it's much better to duplicate something on the timeline rather than drag something in again. Also, you can combine them. So say, for instance, you hold Control and Alt together and drag down. You've duplicated a clip, but also at the same time made sure it didn't change the time of where it was at. Okay, next up, moving clips in a very small way is essentially called nudging. If you press your comma and period key, you are nudging a clip left and right. Now, this may look like it's nudging a good amount of time, and it actually is, because it's nudging every 1 second. You can change it up here at the top. You can change this nudge amount. Instead of being 1 second, you can say, I want you to nudge just 1 frame. And now it's going very, 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 very small intervals. In case you want to move something very precisely, that will let you nudge it in the direction either way. Kind of a cool little feature. And you can change the amount you nudge just going back up here. Another tip that's really helpful is being able to scroll left and right. Now, you do have this bar down here that can let you scroll left and right. Sometimes that's very helpful, sometimes it's not. But if you hold the shift key and use your scroll wheel, you can move left and right. Very, very helpful, especially if you're trying to scroll through and do everything as you go, especially when you're trying to move around the timeline. Say, for instance, you want to add or subtract time to your timeline. If you're working in sync with the video, you probably won't do this. But if you're trying to do something, say, for like an audio drama or a podcast, and you're like, I just need to take out this chunk of time, the best way to do it is through the event window here in time operations, either insert time or cut time. And the reason why this is very helpful is, say, for instance, you have created a marker down here. Let's say we have an ADR marker for pickup line. If we are using this tool here and we select this part and we say, okay, go ahead and cut the time from there to there and go ahead and hit apply. It cuts that time out, but then it also shifts over the marker. If we add time, same thing happens. Say we want to add in, let's add in 3 seconds here. It's done that, but then it moved over our marker. Very important, because say, for instance, we were going to do the opposite. Say I did Alt-Shift-Return and I took everything and I shifted it over. The marker still stays there. That's not what we want, because now the pickup line really is over here. So by using the insert and cut time here, it'll move all your markers with it. That's probably the best way of doing it. There are other editing methods up here. There is shuffle mode, spot, grid. These modes, I am not a big fan of. Maybe they work better for music, but say, for instance, you go to shuffle mode. Essentially what shuffle mode does is it shuffles the things in a different order and moves things along. So say, for instance, I'm working in a post-production process and I move this clip and I move it over here. It has shuffled, meaning that it put the other clip in front of it. Now, if I move this clip, say I put it over here, and now it's shoved everything to the right. I don't know how that's helpful. Everything is now out of sync, and shuffle mode is, the reason why it's red is it kind of can be a little destructive. Spot mode, say, for instance, you want to move a clip. Now you have to actually put a time code for where you want to move it. You can't move anything without putting the time code in. That's what spot mode does. Where that is very helpful, and the one place that I've ever used this is, say, for instance, I've been given a music cue and it has to be at a certain time. I can drag the track in spot mode, and then I can click on, where it's supposed to go and type in the time, and then it'll go exactly to that point. That's where spot mode is really helpful. When you need something to be at an exact cue, that's where it is the most useful. And grid over here, grid's actually a little helpful. If I turn grid mode back on and I move this along, the grid right now is set for 1 second. So if I'm trying to get something that's an interval of 1 second, like say I'm trying to create something that has a certain beat to it, the grid is helpful for that reason. You can set the grid and then move things along, and then you can see the clip kind of snaps to that point. All right, it's going back to slip, turning off grid mode. So if you want to have the clip snap to another, you can go Control Option period, and that'll snap to the right. If you go Control Option and then comma, it'll snap to the left. Kind of helpful, especially if you like things that snap together and you want to bring things back together. You can also right-click the clip and say snap to next, and it'll snap to that. You can also say snap to previous. Other options if you don't like using shortcut keys or you forgot what they are. Lastly, the only other thing I really wanted to talk about is up here, the tools. They do have other tools underneath that I'm not going to go into, but I just want to tell you that they're there. Right here, if you click and hold, there is TCE and loop. Those are other ways of doing trims that can become a loop. There's also over here, we have time, separation, and object. I'm just going to go ahead and leave those there for now because there are more advanced tools that I just don't want to go into right now. Lastly, the other things that I want to go into, if, for instance, you want to play back a certain section of your timeline, you want it to do something like loop, like I want to listen to this over and over and over again. If you right-click on your play button here in the transport window, you can click on loop, and it will go ahead and loop that section over and over and over again. So you can listen to it on repeat. Okay, so the last thing I want to cover in this section is going back to that meter that we set up in the very beginning. This meter, the Ulean loudness meter, if I'm playing what's on my timeline now I haven't done any mixing or anything like that. If I hit play and I can watch everything that's happening on my timeline, I can see what the levels are. Now, there's a lot of stuff in here that has not been mixed. I can see that right there's some red, meaning that it exceeded and peaked in those moments. I can see that this is where everything is getting at like -9 lufs or 10 lufs. So basically, I am exceeding what my meters should be at. So I know that I need to bring the levels down in those spots. That's where this loudness meter really comes in play, is because it's on my master output, I can see that this is what it's supposed to be coming out of the system, and I know that I'm going to have to go through and bring those back down. So this is important because anytime you're editing audio, you need to make sure that you're not going to blow out the speakers of the person listening, or you're not doing something so soft that they won't be able to hear what you're doing. This is how you can set your levels and know they're going out at the proper standard. Now, lastly, I want to do a tiny bit of troubleshooting. Say, for instance, you have Pro Tools open and you click this little button over here, the red X, and you thought, okay, I want to edit again. And you're like, well, where is everything? If you go into Window and Edit, your edit window will come back. There are two different windows for Pro Tools. There's the edit window, and then there's the mix window. This mix window is essentially like an old school mixing console. You have your sliders up and down, your solos, your inserts, your sends, all that stuff is here. That's all well and good. I don't think that most people who are used to modern editing systems use this very much. Mixers can use it all the time. People who have the touch instruments that will correspond with these sliders. You can get instruments that actually can control these sliders here. But for the most part, I don't know too many people who still use that mix window. Most people I know still just use this edit window inside of here. Okay, so that pretty much covers the first video here. The next one, we'll get into a few more of the advanced features of Pro Tools and start to get a little bit more into the artistic side of how you can use Pro Tools to start editing audio.